It was the kind of room that had seen everything. Cigarette smoke hanging in the air like it had nowhere better to be. Half-eaten sandwiches on a folding table nobody had touched in hours. Empty coffee cups lined up along the windowsill. The hallway outside was noisy. Footsteps, laughter, somebody arguing about a mixing board in the next room. But in here, inside this rehearsal space at the edge of the Motown complex in Detroit, the energy had gone very still. Not quiet, still. Like the moment before a storm decides what it wants to do. Marvin Gaye was 22 years old. He had a deal with Motown, which sounded bigger than it actually felt from the inside. He was still mostly unknown, still figuring out where his voice fit in a label that had its own ideas about what a young black singer from Washington, D.C. was supposed to sound like. He had been working for months to be taken seriously, and most days, seriously felt like a long walk to a destination nobody had posted signs for. Little Richard walked into that room like he owned it, because in most rooms he did. By 1962, Little Richard was not just famous, he was foundational. He had spent the better part of a decade rearranging what American music thought it was allowed to do. He had screamed and pounded and hollered and grinned his way into the bones of rock and roll before most people even knew what rock and roll was. His voice was not a voice so much as a force of nature with perfect timing. When he entered a space, the air in that space reorganized itself around him. People stood straighter. Conversations trailed off. You watched him whether you meant to or not. He had a way of looking at younger singers that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity. It was something in between, a kind of professional appraisal that he made no effort to hide. He had seen hundreds of young men with good voices and big dreams come through this industry, and he had a very clear sense of what separated the ones who lasted from the ones who didn't. He believed it was fire, not talent, not discipline, not even instinct. Fire. The thing that came from somewhere below the chest, below the stomach, from somewhere that had no name. You either had it or you were borrowing someone else's heat. He looked at Marvin Gaye for a few long seconds, then he said it. "You don't have the fire, boy." He didn't say it cruel. He didn't need to be cruel. That would have been a waste of energy. He said it the way a man who knows a lot about a thing says it to someone who is still learning. Informative, almost helpful, which was somehow worse. The other people in the room did what people always do in those moments. They looked at the floor. They found reasons to check their notebooks, their watches, the grain of the wooden table. Nobody wanted to be the one to make eye contact with Marvin right then, because that would have required acknowledging what had just happened out loud, and nobody was ready for that. Marvin didn't move. He was sitting on a metal folding chair, one leg crossed over the other, and he stayed exactly like that. He didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't blink fast the way people do when they're trying to absorb something painful. He just looked at Little Richard, not with anger, not with hurt, with something quieter and harder to read than either of those things. The thing about Marvin Gaye that people who only knew him from a distance tended to miss was this. He had been told his whole life that something was wrong with him. His father had told him. A church full of people who expected him to be one thing and got something different had told him. The music industry in its various and creative ways had been telling him since he arrived. He had developed through all of that a particular relationship with being underestimated. He did not argue with it. He did not get loud about it. He stored it somewhere. And then he let the music answer. He stood up slowly. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and folded it over his arm. He looked at the pianist in the corner and gave a small nod. So small it was almost not a nod at all. And then he walked over to the microphone at the center of the room. The pianist, a quiet, careful man who had worked sessions at Motown long enough to know when something important was about to happen, placed his hands over the keys without being asked. He waited. He did not look at Little Richard. He did not look at the other people in the room. He looked only at Marvin, reading whatever signal was there to be read. This was the unspoken language of good musicians, the willingness to follow someone into a space you can't fully see, because you trust that they know where they're going. Marvin stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. Nobody spoke. Little Richard watched him from across the room with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. Then Marvin sang. He didn't start loud. That was the first thing. He started so quietly that the people nearest the door thought at first that he hadn't actually started, that he was still warming up, still finding the pitch. But that was the point. The opening phrase came out soft and low, almost a murmur, almost a conversation with himself, and it reached across that room not by force, but by gravity. The way smoke rises, the way water finds the lowest place, you didn't lean toward it because it demanded your attention. You leaned toward it because you couldn't help yourself. And then it opened up. There is a moment in the best vocal performances, and the people in that room understood this because it was their business to understand it. When you realize the person at the microphone is not performing a song, but inhabiting one. When the notes stop being notes and start being something that you feel in your sternum, in the back of your throat, in the part of your chest that you only notice when something catches it off guard. Marvin Gaye found that place inside the first 30 seconds, and he did not leave it. His voice moved through the song like it already knew where every corner was. He took phrases that any trained singer could execute and made them feel like they were being invented in real time. Like the emotion was so present and so specific that the words themselves were barely keeping up with it. The runs he did were not runs for the sake of showing range. They were the sound of something trying to get out and not quite finding the door, which is the most honest thing a voice can do. He held notes until the room stopped breathing and then released them with a care that made the release feel like a small act of mercy. Little Richard was still standing. He had not moved. His expression had changed. It had not changed into something soft or sentimental. Little Richard was not a sentimental man in any cheap sense of the word, but the professional appraisal that had been on his face when he walked in, the knowing, experienced, slightly superior scan of a man who had heard everything, that was gone. In its place was something rarer and more honest, the look of someone who had just been shown something they had not expected to be shown. Someone recalibrating. He pulled the microphone slightly closer. Another small adjustment, tipping it just a fraction of an inch lower toward his mouth. The kind of thing that means nothing to a casual observer and everything to a person who understands that a singer's relationship with a microphone is a private one, worked out through repetition and instinct over years. He was not performing for the room yet. He was getting ready. He was finding the place inside himself where the song lived. When Marvin finished, he didn't open his eyes immediately. He stood at the microphone with his head slightly bowed, the way you stand after something has cost you something real. Not because he was tired, because he had meant it, and meaning things takes something out of you that showmanship alone never does. The room was quiet for a beat. 2 beats, long enough that the quiet became its own kind of statement. Little Richard said nothing, and that silence, from a man whose whole identity was built on never being at a loss for words, on filling every available space with sound and presence and performance, that silence said more than any compliment would have. The other people in the room understood it. You could see it in the way they exhaled. In the careful, deliberate way they did not look at each other, because looking at each other would have broken something that was better left whole. Marvin picked up his jacket from where he had set it on the floor. He put it on. He nodded once at the pianist, a nod that meant thank you. And then he walked toward the door with the same quiet economy with which he had walked toward the microphone. No flourish, no backward glance. Just a man who had answered a question and had no particular interest in watching the answer land. What happened in that room did not make any newspaper. There was no review, no recording, no official account. It was the kind of moment that lives in the memories of the small number of people who were present, passed down through conversations in studios and dressing rooms over the years, gaining the weight that true stories gain when they have nowhere to go but deeper into the people who carry them. But those who were there would talk about it for the rest of their careers, not because it was dramatic in any theatrical sense, because it was true, because they had witnessed the exact moment when a young man who had been told he lacked something fundamental stood in front of the person who said it and, without raising his voice or changing his expression, proved that the wrong man had been doing the measuring. Little Richard understood fire better than almost anyone alive. He had built his whole life and career on it. He knew what it felt like to stand in front of a microphone and give the audience something that came from a place they couldn't name and couldn't fake. That knowledge was exactly why he recognized, in those 4 or 5 minutes in that Detroit rehearsal room, that what Marvin Gaye had was not the absence of fire. It was fire that had learned to burn without showing its smoke. And that, if anything, is the harder thing to do. The louder flame announces itself. The quiet one is the one you don't notice until you're already warm. Marvin Gaye would go on to make music that rewrote the rules of what soul music was allowed to say and feel and mean. He would make albums that started conversations that the music industry was not ready to have. He would sing about pain and politics and desire and God with a directness that made people uncomfortable and grateful at the same time. None of it would come from a place of trying to prove something to the people who had doubted him. It would come from the same place it always came from. That interior space where he seemed to live more fully than anywhere else. But if you wanted to trace the line back, if you wanted to find the moment when Marvin Gaye stepped fully into what he was capable of being, you could do worse than to point to a room in Detroit that smelled like cold coffee and cigarette smoke. A room where a man who knew everything about fire said the wrong thing to the wrong person, and a man who had been quiet for long enough finally opened his mouth and answered. Have you ever had to fight a whole system just to show them your true soul? Tell us your story in the comments.